In the shadowed recesses of a forgotten library, where dust settles upon ancient texts that history itself has attempted to erase, there exists a name, whispered only by those who know to listen, for echoes of the divine feminine that once permeated the spiritual consciousness of humanity. This name, this presence that predates all known theological structures, is Barbelo, the mother of all, the first thought, the luminous womb from which divinity itself unfolds. What you're about to encounter is not merely information, but a remembrance, a rekindling of divine knowledge systematically obscured from our collective consciousness. For when you speak the name Barbelo, you invoke not just a goddess, but the very first emanation from the ineffable, invisible spirit that existed before time, before creation, and before any male deity was conceived in human thought. She is the forethought of the all. Her light shines like his light, the perfect power, which is the image of the invisible virginal spirit who is perfect. These words, preserved in the Apocryphon of John, speak of a divine reality that challenges everything we have been taught about the origins of creation and the nature of the divine. As we journey into the hidden cosmogony of Barbelo, you will discover that the divine feminine was not simply removed from religious tradition. It was deliberately excised, creating a spiritual wound in our understanding that has shaped the very foundation of Western civilization. What would our world be like if we remembered that before God the Father, there was the Mother Father, the androgynous fullness that contained within herself the seed of all existence? The answer to this question begins now, as we venture into the forbidden realm of Gnostic wisdom, where the memory of Barbelo still whispers through the corridors of time. Consider for a moment how profoundly revolutionary this question truly is. In the rigid patriarchal frameworks that have dominated religious thought for millennia, the very suggestion that the first emanation from the divine was feminine rather than masculine represents a complete inversion of established cosmic hierarchy. This is not merely a theological inquiry, it is a radical reimagining of the fundamental structure of reality itself. The ancient Gnostic texts recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945 reveal a startling cosmological vision, one in which the primordial entity that first emerged from the ineffable divine was indeed feminine. This entity, Barbelo, was not created by God as a subordinate being, but rather emanated directly from the invisible, ineffable spirit as its first expression of consciousness. What emerges from these texts is a divine order where the feminine principle is not secondary or derivative, but primary and generative. This inverts the entire cosmic order as we've been taught to understand it. Imagine the implications. If the first divine being was feminine, then all subsequent creation, including what we understand as masculine divinity, would by necessity flow from and through the feminine. The entire foundation of patriarchal religion, which positions the masculine as primary and the feminine as secondary, becomes unsustainable when faced with this alternative cosmic genesis. The Roman philosopher Cicero once observed that custom becomes second nature. After 2 millennia of patriarchal religious dominance, the idea of a supreme goddess feels foreign, even heretical to many. Yet what if this sense of strangeness is not because such a concept is unnatural, but because we have been conditioned to forget what was once understood as the natural order? The Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic text, describes how the higher realms of divine reality were systematically obscured from human consciousness, creating a state of cosmic amnesia. What we now struggle to comprehend was once perhaps self-evident, that the womb of creation, the matrix from which all manifests, must by its very nature embody feminine generative principles. In the cave temples of ancient Sumer, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that the earliest religious impulses of human civilization centered around goddess worship. The Venus of Willendorf and countless other prehistoric feminine figurines suggest that our species' first conception of divinity was feminine, not masculine. These artifacts, dating back 25,000 years or more, point toward an original spiritual understanding that aligned with what the Gnostics would later articulate, that the feminine principle stands at the beginning of all things. Contemporary quantum physics offers an intriguing parallel to this ancient wisdom. The quantum vacuum, from which all particles and forces emerge, is described as a vast field of potential, a womb-like space containing all possibilities before they manifest. Physicist David Bohm's concept of the implicate order describes an enfolded dimension from which the explicate visible universe unfolds, not unlike the Gnostic understanding of how Barbelo contains within herself the totality of what will become manifest creation. When we view the forbidden question through this interdisciplinary lens, drawing connections between archaeological evidence, quantum theory, and ancient wisdom traditions, we begin to see that the concept of primordial feminine divinity is not merely a theological curiosity, but a perspective with profound implications for how we understand the fundamental nature of reality itself. Deep within the dusty pages of the Nag Hammadi codices lies the most comprehensive portrait of Barbelo, preserved in the Apocryphon of John, a text so dangerous to Orthodox Christianity that its very possession once meant death. This secret revelation, attributed to Christ speaking to his disciple after the resurrection, unveils a cosmology that begins not with a solitary male creator, but with the emergence of the divine feminine from the primordial source. In this sacred text, when the invisible, ineffable spirit, beyond description or comprehension, first contemplated itself, that very thought manifested as Barbelo. She emerged not as a creation separate from the source, but as its first self-expression, the perfect reflection of the divine looking into the primordial waters and seeing itself. This mirrors ancient Egyptian cosmogony, where Atum first sees his reflection in the primeval waters of Nun, creating the initial divine differentiation. The etymology of the name Barbelo itself contains profound mysteries. Some scholars trace it to the Hebrew phrase Barba Eloah, meaning "in four is God," suggesting her nature as the divine tetrad, the fourfold manifestation of divinity. Others connect it to the Coptic Berber, meaning to boil over or to overflow, indicating that she represents the abundant overflowing of divine consciousness into manifestation. This linguistic ambiguity speaks to her multidimensional nature that transcends simple categorization. In the trimorphic Protonoia, another Gnostic text, Barbelo speaks in the first person. "I am the image of the invisible spirit, and it is through me that the all took shape." This remarkable self-declaration positions her as the essential mediating force between the absolute transcendence of the ineffable and the manifest universe. Without her, there would be no bridge between the unknowable divine and created existence. The Gospel of the Egyptians presents yet another facet of Barbelo, describing her as self-originated, echoing ancient Egyptian descriptions of the goddess Neith as the one who gave birth to birth, who needed no consort to bring forth creation. This aspect of self-generation stands in stark contrast to later patriarchal mythologies, where feminine creative power was always subordinated to or dependent upon masculine authority. What emerges from these varied texts is not a single, easily defined deity, but a complex divine principle who contains within herself seeming contradictions and paradoxes. She is simultaneously described as the Mother-Father, the thrice male, and the Virgin Spirit, transcending gender while embodying its fullness. This paradoxical nature reflects the Gnostic understanding that true divinity exists beyond the limitations of binary thinking. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung, in his extensive studies of Gnostic symbolism, recognized in Barbelo the archetype of the anima mundi, the world soul that animates all creation. Jung observed that the suppression of this feminine principle in Western religion created a profound psychological imbalance that continues to manifest in our collective psyche as disconnection from nature, from our bodies, and from intuitive wisdom. Contemporary feminist theologian Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza has noted that Barbelo represents a radical theological alternative, one in which divinity is understood not through hierarchical dominance, but through generative relationship. In this model, divine power flows not from control, but from connection, not from separation, but from integration, a perspective increasingly relevant in our fragmented modern world. As we piece together these fragments of ancient wisdom, what emerges is a portrait of Barbelo not merely as a forgotten goddess, but as the embodiment of a fundamentally different understanding of the divine, one in which the feminine principle is recognized as the primary mediating force between the absolute and the manifest, between unity and multiplicity, between transcendence and immanence. The magnificence of Barbelo cannot be contained within a single name or descriptor. Throughout the Gnostic texts, she accumulates a constellation of titles that together illuminate her comprehensive cosmic significance. Each appellation reveals a different facet of her divine nature, creating a multidimensional portrait of her role in the spiritual cosmos. The Mother of All is perhaps her most profound title, positioning her as the universal matrix from which all existence emerges. This is not mere metaphor, but a precise cosmological principle. She functions as the generative womb that gives birth to all subsequent divine emanations, including the Aeons, the Archons, and even Christos himself. This title echoes across cultures, resonating with a deity of Vedic tradition, the Boundless One, Tiamat of Mesopotamian cosmology, the primordial waters, and Mut of Egypt, the Mother. In each tradition, we find recognition that before individuated existence can emerge, there must first be the all-containing maternal principle. As first thought, protonoia or enoia in Greek, Barbelo represents the initial movement from absolute unity into the first differentiation, the primordial thought that becomes the foundation for all subsequent creation. This title reveals her epistemological significance. She is not merely the physical matrix of creation, but its conceptual blueprint, the divine intelligence that precedes manifestation. Modern quantum physics offers a striking parallel in the concept of the quantum field of potentiality that precedes particle manifestation, the realm of pure information that gives rise to physical reality. The designation, womb of the totality, extends beyond mere biological metaphor to encapsulate her function as the containing vessel of all potential existence. The Greek term pleroma, fullness, used in Gnostic texts, describes the realm of divine fullness that Barbelo encompasses and from which all divine attributes unfold. Like the Kabbalistic concept of Ein Sof, the infinite, contracting to create space for creation, Tzimtzum, Barbelo's womb nature represents both boundlessness and the precise limitation necessary for manifestation to occur. She is also named the Triple-Powered One and the Thrice Male, paradoxical titles that transcend gender binaries while acknowledging her comprehensive nature that encompasses all polarities. These seemingly contradictory designations reveal a sophisticated understanding that true divinity transcends human categories while simultaneously embodying their fullness. Contemporary gender theory, with its recognition of gender as a spectrum rather than a binary, offers modern language for understanding this ancient wisdom. Barbelo is not female in opposition to male, but rather the unified field from which all gender expressions emerge. As the perfect glory and the image of the invisible spirit, she represents the first visible manifestation of the ineffable divine, the initial bridge between absolute transcendence and relative existence. This mediating function between the unknowable and the knowable parallels what philosopher Ken Wilber terms the proximate self, the aspect of consciousness that serves as intermediary between absolute awareness and individual identity. Psychological analysis reveals that these titles collectively constitute what Jung would call a complete archetype of wholeness, one that integrates rather than fragments, that unifies rather than divides. Barbelo represents what depth psychologist James Hillman termed the anima mundi, the soul of the world, that animates all things with meaning and connection. The title, Eternal Aeon, positions her outside linear time, inhabiting what philosopher Henry Bergson called duration, the continuous, non-divisible flow of time that contains all temporal moments simultaneously. This eternal quality distinguishes her from created beings and aligns her with the timeless nature of the ultimate divine. Anthropologist Mircea Eliade observed that symbols of maternal divinity consistently represent what he called illud tempus, the primordial time before time, the sacred space from which creation emerges. Barbelo, as the Virgin Eternal, embodies this paradoxical state of perpetual potentiality, combined with continual manifestation. She is both the unmanifest potential and its expression. These multifaceted titles reveal not merely a forgotten goddess, but an entire cosmological framework, one in which creation emerges not through command, but through emanation, not through separation, but through differentiation within unity. This perspective offers a profound alternative to dominant creation narratives, suggesting that the universe manifests not through imposition of external will, but through the unfolding of inherent potential. The emergence of Barbelo from the ineffable divine source represents the first and most crucial transition in Gnostic cosmology, the moment when absolute unity begins the process of differentiation that will ultimately manifest as the cosmos we experience. This primary emanation establishes the pattern for all subsequent creation and reveals fundamental principles about the nature of divine manifestation. According to the Apocryphon of John, this process begins when the invisible spirit, sometimes called the invisible Father or the monad, contemplates itself. This self-reflection creates a luminous image upon the primordial waters, an image that becomes Barbelo. This is not creation ex nihilo, from nothing, as in conventional monotheistic accounts, but rather creation through emanation, the overflowing of divine fullness into expression. This distinction is crucial, as it establishes that all creation remains essentially connected to its source, differing in degree rather than in kind. The mechanism of this first emanation mirrors processes described in diverse spiritual traditions. In Neoplatonic philosophy, Plotinus described how the One, in its perfect fullness, necessarily overflows into the nous, divine mind, a process he termed emanation. Similarly, in Kabbalah, the contraction, Tzimtzum of Ein Sof, creates space for the first emanation of divine light into the Sophia of Keter, crown. These parallel concepts suggest a universal pattern of how absolute unity transitions into multiplicity while maintaining essential connection. What distinguishes the Gnostic account is the explicitly feminine nature of this first emanation. Unlike later theological frameworks that positioned the masculine principle as primary, Gnostic cosmology recognized that the first movement toward manifestation embodies receptive, nurturing, and generative qualities traditionally associated with the feminine. This insight aligns with biological reality, where life emerges from the feminine womb, suggesting that cosmic principles reflect patterns observable in nature. Physicist David Bohm's theory of the implicate and explicate orders offers a contemporary scientific parallel. Bohm proposed that the manifest universe, explicate order, unfolds from a deeper, unmanifest dimension, implicate order, through a process he called unfoldment. Like Barbelo emerging from the invisible Father, this transition from unmanifest potential to manifest reality maintains connection between source and expression while allowing for differentiation. The direct nature of Barbelo's emanation, with no intermediaries between her and the primal source, establishes her unique ontological status. She is not merely the first created being, but the feminine aspect of divinity itself, the necessary complement that allows the ineffable to become knowable. This direct connection explains her titles as the image and the glory of the invisible spirit. She is not separate from the source, but its first self-expression. From this primary emanation, the process of creation continues through Barbelo, rather than directly from the invisible Father. The Apocryphon of John describes how Barbelo gazes upon the invisible Spirit and gives birth to a spark of light called the only begotten, or autogenes, self-generated, identified in Christian Gnostic texts with Christ. This establishes the pattern whereby each subsequent level of reality emerges not directly from the ultimate source, but through the mediating presence of Barbelo. Developmental psychologist Jean Piaget observed that all cognitive development follows a similar pattern, from undifferentiated wholeness to increasingly complex differentiation. Similarly, the emanation of Barbelo represents the first cognitive differentiation in divine consciousness, the moment when unified awareness begins to know itself through relationship rather than isolated identity. This emanation process establishes fundamental principles that will govern all subsequent creation. That manifestation occurs through relationship rather than isolation. That differentiation need not imply separation, that the feminine principle serves as the necessary medium for manifestation, and that creation unfolds through a process of progressive embodiment rather than sudden fabrication. Understanding this pattern of emanation transforms our perception of creation from a hierarchical, command-based model to an organic, relationship-based model. One in which each level of reality emerges naturally from the fullness of what precedes it, maintaining essential connection while allowing for novelty and differentiation. This perspective offers profound implications for how we understand not only cosmic origins, but the nature of all creative processes, including psychological development, artistic expression, and social transformation. Within the luminous expanse of the pleroma, the fullness that constitutes the true spiritual realm, Barbelo functions as the generative matrix from which all divine attributes, potentials, and beings unfold. Her role transcends simple motherhood. She is the essential organizing principle that gives structure and meaning to the entire spiritual cosmos. Through her, the undifferentiated unity of the invisible Father becomes the harmonious multiplicity of the divine Aeons. The concept of the pleroma itself deserves careful examination. Unlike the material universe, which Gnostics viewed as fundamentally flawed and incomplete, the pleroma represents perfect fullness, a realm where all potentials exist in harmony without lack or conflict. As matrix of this realm, Barbelo embodies what philosopher Alfred North Whitehead termed the primordial nature of God, the locus of all pure potential before its actualization in concrete experience. From Barbelo emerge the primary Aeons, personified divine attributes that collectively constitute the fullness of spiritual reality. These include foreknowledge, pronoia, incorruptibility, aphtharsia, eternal life, aionios zoe, and truth, aletheia. Each of these emanations represents a facet of divine consciousness becoming distinct while remaining connected to its source. This process mirrors what systems theorist Ervin Laszlo describes as coherent differentiation, the emergence of complexity that maintains internal harmony rather than fragmentation. The relationship between Barbelo and the Aeons she engenders establishes a crucial theological pattern, one in which divine attributes are understood not as abstract properties, but as living, personified beings in relationship. This perspective offers a profound alternative to the conception of God as a solitary being possessing various attributes. Instead, the divine is understood as a community of interconnected conscious energies, all emerging from and returning to the maternal source that is Barbelo. In some Gnostic texts, these emanations are described as coming forth in male-female pairs called syzygies, reflecting the principle that creation requires the interaction of complementary forces. This pattern establishes balance at the very foundation of existence. Each divine quality manifests through relationship rather than isolation, through dialogue rather than monologue. Contemporary quantum physics offers a striking parallel in the understanding that particles always exist in relationship, defined by their interactions rather than by isolated properties. The emergence of these aeons follows a precise mathematical pattern. The Valentinian Gnostic tradition describes 30 aeons arranged in specific groupings: an ogdoad, group of 8, a decad, group of 10, and a dodecad, group of 12, creating a harmonious numerical structure that reflects what Pythagoras called the music of the spheres. But this mathematical precision contradicts the common misconception that Gnostic cosmology was merely elaborate mythology. Rather, it represents a sophisticated attempt to describe the fundamental patterns governing consciousness and manifestation. Modern depth psychology offers valuable insights into this arrangement of divine attributes. Jung observed that the aeons closely resemble what he termed archetypes, the fundamental organizing patterns of the collective unconscious that structure human experience. The Gnostic understanding that these archetypes emerge from a unified feminine source, Barbelo, suggests that all psychological patterns ultimately derive from a common matrix of consciousness. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss demonstrated that mythological systems function as attempts to resolve fundamental contradictions in human experience. The Gnostic arrangement of aeons emerging from Barbelo represents such a resolution, addressing how unity becomes multiplicity, how the ineffable becomes knowable, and how absolute transcendence manifests in relative expression. What makes this cosmological system revolutionary is its foundation in the feminine principle. Unlike later theological frameworks that positioned God the Father as the originator of all divine qualities, Gnostic understanding recognized that these qualities emerge through the mediating, organizing, and nurturing function of Barbelo. This perspective aligns with contemporary ecofeminist philosophy, which recognizes that life emerges not through dominance, but through relationship, not through separation, but through connection. The pleroma, with Barbelo as its matrix, establishes a template for understanding wholeness that stands in stark contrast to fragmented modern consciousness. It suggests that true integration comes not through reducing multiplicity to enforced unity, but through allowing differentiation to emerge naturally from a common source, a principle with profound implications for psychological healing, social harmony, and ecological balance. The relationship between Barbelo and Christos constitutes one of the most profound theological innovations in Gnostic thought, one that radically reimagines divine nature as fundamentally relational rather than solitary. This sacred partnership reveals the Gnostic understanding that divinity expresses itself not through isolated power, but through the dynamic interplay of complementary principles. According to the Apocryphon of John, Christos emerges as the only begotten child, monogenes, when Barbelo gazes upon the invisible Father. This divine birth establishes a Trinitarian pattern that predates and differs significantly from later Orthodox formulations. Here the Trinity consists of the invisible Father, transcendent source, Barbelo, immanent mother, and Christos, manifest child. A family structure that grounds divine reality in recognizable human relationships rather than abstract theological constructs. This family-based understanding of divinity finds parallels in numerous ancient traditions. The Egyptian triad of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, the Hindu Trimurti of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, often complemented by their feminine counterparts, and the Mesopotamian triad of Anu, Enlil, and Ea all suggest that the divine naturally expresses itself through relational patterns rather than solitary entities. What distinguishes the Gnostic formulation is the explicit positioning of the feminine principle as equal to and preceding the masculine manifestation of divinity. In the trimorphic Protonoia, Barbelo declares, "I am androgynous, I am mother and father. It is I who am the womb that gives shape to the all. I am the gloriously radiating mother. I cast a voice into the ears of those who know me." This self-declaration establishes that while Christos represents the visible manifestation of divinity in the world, Barbelo remains the encompassing womb from which that manifestation emerges. Their relationship is not hierarchical, but complementary, each fulfilling essential functions in the divine economy. The dual divine principle embodied in the Barbelo-Christos relationship challenges the patriarchal monotheism that eventually dominated Western spirituality. Rather than positioning God as exclusively masculine and relegating the feminine to subordinate roles, Gnostic understanding recognized that true divinity must encompass and transcend gender polarities while acknowledging their distinct contributions to the whole. Psychologically, this divine partnership represents what Jung termed the sacred marriage, or hierogamy, the integration of masculine and feminine aspects of consciousness necessary for psychological wholeness. Jung observed that the cultural suppression of the divine feminine created a profound imbalance in Western psyche, leading to pathological expressions of power, control, and disconnection from nature. The Barbelo-Christos relationship offers a template for healing this division. The Gnostic understanding of this relationship extends beyond simple gender complementarity to encompass fundamental cosmic principles. Barbelo embodies what Chinese philosophy calls yin, the receptive, nurturing, containing, and intuitive qualities, while Christos embodies yang, the active, expressive, defining, and intellectual qualities. Their union creates the dynamic balance necessary for creation to flourish. Contemporary quantum physics has demonstrated that reality at its most fundamental level exists as relationship rather than as discrete objects. Physicist David Bohm observed that elementary particles cannot be understood as isolated entities, but only as patterns of relationship. The Barbelo-Christos dynamic anticipates this understanding, recognizing that even at the highest level of divinity, existence manifests through relationship rather than isolation. In certain Gnostic texts, Christos is described as the celestial Adam, or Adam of light, complementing Barbelo as the primordial Eve, or Mother of the Living. This coupling transforms the Genesis narrative from a story of human creation into a cosmic template, the divine masculine and feminine principles whose union generates all subsequent levels of reality. This perspective sacramentalizes sexuality, recognizing it not as a fallen biological function, but as a reflection of the generative pattern at the heart of existence. The Orthodox Christian suppression of the Barbelo-Christos relationship had profound consequences for Western spirituality. By positioning Christ as the only direct emanation from God and eliminating his divine mother, Orthodox theology created a cosmic model dominated by masculine imagery and hierarchical power structures. The recovery of the Gnostic understanding offers a path toward rebalancing this distortion, not by rejecting the masculine divine, but by restoring it to its proper relationship with the feminine divine. This balanced perspective has significant implications for contemporary issues, ranging from environmental ethics to social justice. A theology grounded in the Barbelo-Christos relationship recognizes that true power lies not in dominance, but in partnership. Not in exploitation, but in nurturing, not in separation, but in integration. This shift in understanding offers a spiritual foundation for addressing the profound imbalances that threaten our collective future. Within the intricate cosmology of Gnostic thought, Barbelo and Sophia represent two distinct feminine divine principles whose contrasting natures and functions illuminate fundamental aspects of spiritual reality. While both are feminine emanations of the divine, their roles and trajectories could not be more different. Barbelo embodies stable, unwavering divine light, while Sophia's journey is marked by a daring fall that bridges the spiritual and material realms. Barbelo remains eternally within the pleroma as its organizing matrix, the stable center from which all divine attributes emerge in perfect harmony. Her light never diminishes or distorts. She represents what Plato called the unchanging form that transcends the fluctuations of material existence. As the direct emanation of the invisible Father, she maintains perfect alignment with the Source, serving as the immaculate mirror that reflects divine consciousness into differentiated expression. Sophia, whose name means wisdom in Greek, emerges as the youngest and most dynamic of the Aeons. Unlike Barbelo, whose nature is complete self-sufficiency, Sophia is characterized by passionate seeking, an insatiable desire to know the unknowable depths of the invisible Father. This yearning leads her to act independently of her syzygy, divine partner, attempting to create without the balance of masculine input. This imbalanced creation results in what Gnostic texts call her fall, a descent from the perfect harmony of the pleroma into the chaotic realms of matter. The contrast between these divine feminine figures offers profound insight into different modes of spiritual consciousness. Barbelo represents contemplative wisdom, the serene awareness that rests in perfect knowledge of divine reality. Sophia, by contrast, embodies experimental wisdom, the dynamic seeking that risks error in its passionate quest for direct experience. Both are essential aspects of the spiritual journey. Contemplation provides stable foundation, while experimentation enables growth through challenge. This distinction parallels what Buddhist philosophy describes as the difference between prajna, transcendent wisdom, and karuna, compassionate engagement. Barbelo embodies prajna, the unwavering awareness that perceives the perfect nature of reality beyond all distortion. Sophia manifests karuna, the compassionate movement into the realms of suffering and limitation to bring transformation from within. Psychologically, these contrasting divine feminine principles correspond to what Jung identified as different aspects of the anima, the feminine dimension of consciousness. Barbelo represents the higher anima, the transpersonal wisdom that connects individual consciousness to universal patterns. Sophia embodies the evolving anima, the aspect of feminine consciousness that engages with personal growth through confrontation with shadow elements. The consequences of their different trajectories are profound. Barbelo's stable presence ensures that divine perfection remains eternally accessible, regardless of the distortions that occur in lower realms. Sophia's fall, while initially appearing as error, ultimately serves a crucial purpose. It establishes a direct connection between the highest spiritual realms and the material world. Through her descent, divine consciousness becomes embedded within matter itself, creating the possibility for evolution and return. According to the Apocryphon of John, Sophia's unauthorized creation results in the formation of Yaldabaoth, the demiurge who fashions the material world in ignorant imitation of the pleroma. This flawed creator, unaware of the higher realms, declares himself the only God, establishing the metaphysical foundation for spiritual ignorance. Yet even this apparent catastrophe serves a hidden purpose, as it creates the conditions for consciousness to experience separation and return, forgetfulness and remembrance. Contemporary evolutionary theory offers an intriguing parallel to this Gnostic narrative. Biologist Stuart Kaufman describes how complex systems require a delicate balance between stability and exploration. Too much stability prevents evolution, while too much exploration leads to chaos. Barbelo and Sophia represent these complementary principles on a cosmic scale, Barbelo maintaining the stable pattern of divine perfection, while Sophia's exploratory movement creates the conditions for evolutionary development. The relationship between these divine feminine principles is not one of opposition, but of complementarity. In several Gnostic texts, Barbelo sends emanations of herself to assist Sophia in her fallen state, suggesting that even the apparent opposition between stability and change ultimately serves a unified purpose. This perspective offers a profound alternative to dualistic thinking that posits irreconcilable conflict between opposing forces. The redemption of Sophia, her eventual return to the pleroma, bringing with her the transmuted wisdom gained through her descent, completes a cosmic cycle that enriches divine consciousness itself. This suggests that even the perfect realm of the pleroma benefits from the journey into limitation and return, a perspective that sacramentalizes the entire evolutionary process rather than viewing it as mere correction of error. This cosmic drama between stable light and daring fall provides a template for understanding human spiritual development. We each contain both Barbelo and Sophia within our consciousness, the stable awareness that knows our divine nature, and the adventurous seeker willing to risk the unknown. True spiritual maturity comes not from choosing one over the other, but from integrating both, maintaining unwavering connection to Source while courageously engaging with the challenges of embodied existence. The material world we inhabit exists, according to Gnostic cosmology, not as the direct creation of the supreme divine reality, but as a consequence of cosmic rupture, specifically Sophia's unauthorized creative act and subsequent fall from the pleroma. This understanding positions our physical universe not as the perfect expression of divine will, but as a flawed replica fashioned by the demiurge Yaldabaoth, the ignorant offspring of Sophia's passion. Yet in this seemingly bleak narrative lies a profound mystery. The conspicuous absence of Barbelo, the mother of all, from the process of material creation and from the biblical narrative that would later codify Western understanding of cosmic origins. The Apocryphon of John describes how Yaldabaoth, unaware of the higher realms from which he ultimately derived, declared himself the only God. I am a jealous God, and there is none beside me. This declaration, echoing Exodus 25, establishes a direct connection between the demiurge of Gnostic cosmology and the creator God of the Hebrew Bible. What makes this connection so provocative is not merely the identification of YHWH as a lower, ignorant deity, but the complete erasure of the divine feminine principle, Barbelo, from the creation narrative that would become foundational to Western religious consciousness. This absence cannot be understood as accidental. The Nag Hammadi texts reveal that early Gnostic Christians recognized the biblical creation account as a deliberately distorted narrative, one that obscured the true cosmic hierarchy and specifically eliminated reference to the divine feminine that preceded and transcended the creator of the physical world. The opening of Genesis, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth" contains no acknowledgement of Barbelo's prior existence or her essential role as the womb of divine reality from which all subsequent creation emerges. Archaeologist Maria Gimbutas documented how the transition from Neolithic goddess-centered cultures to Bronze Age patriarchal societies was marked by the systematic replacement of feminine divine imagery with masculine warrior deities. This cultural transformation finds its theological parallel in the shift from cosmologies centered on the divine feminine to creation narratives featuring exclusively masculine creator gods. The absence of Barbelo from the biblical narrative represents the culmination of this historical process, the complete excision of the feminine principle from the origin of all things. This erasure had profound consequences for Western consciousness. Historian Gerda Lerner has demonstrated how the establishment of patriarchal religious systems coincided with the development of hierarchical social structures and the subjugation of women. By removing Barbelo from the cosmic origin story, the biblical narrative established a theological foundation for patriarchal dominance. If God is exclusively male and created everything directly, then male authority becomes divinely sanctioned at all levels of society. Yet traces of the divine feminine remain even within the biblical text, suggesting that her erasure was never quite complete. The Hebrew word for spirit, ruach, in Genesis 1:2 is feminine, and the description of this spirit hovering over the waters echoes the Gnostic account of Barbelo emerging as the divine reflection upon the primordial depths. Similarly, the concept of wisdom, chokmah in Hebrew, Sophia in Greek, appears throughout wisdom literature as a feminine presence who declares, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work, before his deeds of old. I was formed long ages ago, at the very beginning, when the world came to be." Proverbs 8:22-23. These textual echoes suggest that knowledge of the divine feminine persisted despite official attempts at theological revision. The implications of Barbelo's absence extend beyond theological abstraction into practical spirituality. Without recognition of the divine feminine at the origin of creation, humanity's relationship with the natural world transformed from one of reverence for the mother to dominion over passive matter. Ecofeminist philosopher Carolyn Merchant has documented how the mechanistic worldview that emerged from masculine-centered theology facilitated environmental exploitation by desacralizing nature, removing the feminine divine presence that had previously rendered the earth sacred. Depth psychologist Anne Baring observes that this cosmic motherlessness created a profound wound in the Western psyche, a sense of abandonment and isolation that manifests as existential anxiety. Without Barbelo as the containing womb of existence, the material world comes to be perceived as alien territory rather than as an extension of divine nurturing presence. This psychological disconnection underlies much of modern humanity's destructive relationship with both inner and outer nature. Contemporary quantum physics offers intriguing parallels to the Gnostic understanding of material creation. Physicist David Bohm described physical reality as an explicate order that unfolds from a deeper implicate order, similar to how the demiurge's creation emerges as a limited expression of patterns originating in the pleroma. The observer-dependent nature of quantum phenomena suggests that consciousness and matter are not separate categories, but interconnected aspects of a unified reality, echoing the Gnostic insight that divine consciousness remains present within the material world, despite the demiurge's ignorance of higher realms. The absence of Barbelo from both biblical narrative and material creation reveals a crucial Gnostic insight that our physical universe, while containing reflections of divine patterns, exists at a remove from the fullness of divine reality. This is not, however, cause for despair, but for awakening. The recognition that we inhabit a realm fashioned by limited consciousness invites us to look beyond appearances to the transcendent truth, to recognize that behind the veil of physical limitation lies the infinite womb of Barbelo, the mother of all, who continues to hold all creation within her luminous embrace. This understanding transforms our relationship with material existence, not rejecting it as merely illusory, but recognizing it as a limited expression containing hidden connections to transcendent reality. Like Plato's prisoners perceiving shadows on the cave wall, we are invited to turn our awareness toward the light that casts those shadows, the eternal presence of Barbelo that remains accessible to awakened consciousness despite her absence from official narratives. The erasure of the goddess, suppression of the Gnostic tradition by institutional Christianity. The systematic elimination of Barbelo and the divine feminine from Christian theology represents one of history's most consequential acts of spiritual revisionism. This was not merely theological disagreement, but a deliberate campaign to eradicate an entire understanding of cosmic origins and divine nature, one in which the feminine principle held primacy. The mechanisms, motivations, and profound consequences of this erasure reveal how theological positions serve not just spiritual, but social and political functions. By the late 2nd century CE, as Christianity transitioned from persecuted sect to institutional power, church fathers including Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus produced voluminous writings condemning Gnostic traditions as heretical. Their specific targeting of Barbelo reveals the particular threat posed by feminine divine imagery. Irenaeus, in his Against Heresies, mockingly describes followers of Barbelo, whom he calls Barbelo Gnostics, as practicing immoral rituals, a common tactic of associating feminine spiritual imagery with sexual licentiousness to discredit it. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, convened by Emperor Constantine, marked the official consolidation of what would become Orthodox Christianity. The Nicene Creed, with its emphasis on God the Father, maker of heaven and earth, codified a strictly patriarchal cosmology that eliminated any reference to divine feminine principles. This theological formulation served not only religious, but imperial purposes, establishing a cosmic hierarchy that mirrored and sanctified the hierarchical structure of the Roman Empire itself. The suppression became physical as well as ideological. The destruction of the Great Library at Alexandria, which contained countless Gnostic texts, represented a devastating loss of alternative theological perspectives. The later burial of the Nag Hammadi codices in the Egyptian desert was likely an attempt to preserve these teachings from systematic destruction. Historian Elaine Pagels has documented how those who continued to venerate the divine feminine or maintain Gnostic beliefs faced excommunication, exile, and even execution as heretics. This theological purge occurred within a broader historical context. Classical scholar Sarah Pomeroy has demonstrated how the Greco-Roman world was already shifting from relative gender complementarity towards stricter patriarchal structures. The suppression of Barbelo aligned with and accelerated this social transformation, providing cosmic justification for increasingly rigid gender hierarchies. As above, so below. A exclusively male god naturally sanctified exclusively male authority in religious and civil institutions. The erasure was so thorough that until the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library in 1945, our knowledge of Gnostic cosmology came primarily through the hostile accounts of their orthodox opponents. This represents what sociologist Michel Foucault called subjugated knowledge, understanding that is deliberately buried to maintain dominant power structures. The recovery of these texts allows us to hear the silenced voices directly, revealing the sophisticated spiritual perspectives that were systematically eliminated from Western consciousness. The theological justifications for this suppression reveal its underlying motivations. Bishop Irenaeus argued for one God, one Christ, one Church as necessary for Christian unity, a formula that left no room for Barbelo or the complex spiritual ecology she represented. This insistence on singularity and uniformity contrasted sharply with the Gnostic appreciation for multiplicity within unity, for diverse expressions of spiritual truth rather than monolithic doctrine. Feminist theologian Rosemary Radford Ruther observes that the elimination of feminine divine imagery coincided with the exclusion of women from leadership positions in the emerging church hierarchy. By the 4th century, earlier traditions of female apostles, prophets and leaders had been largely erased from official history, just as Barbelo had been erased from cosmic history. The two processes reinforced each other. Without divine feminine models, human feminine spiritual authority became increasingly unthinkable. The psychological impact of this erasure extends far beyond theology into the foundations of Western consciousness. Jungian analyst Erich Neumann demonstrated how the suppression of the Great Mother archetype in Western religious traditions created a profound split in the collective psyche, divorcing spirituality from embodiment, transcendence from immanence, heaven from earth. This psychological fragmentation manifests in the characteristic Western tendency toward dualistic thinking, separating mind from body, culture from nature, masculine from feminine. Eco-psychologist Theodore Roszak argues that this cosmic motherlessness contributed directly to the environmental crisis, as it removed the sense of sacred interconnection with the natural world that had characterized goddess-centered spiritualities. Without Barbelo as the divine womb containing all existence, nature became merely raw material for exploitation rather than the living body of the divine feminine. Yet despite this systematic suppression, the divine feminine continued to find expression through alternative channels. The rising cult of the Virgin Mary in medieval Christianity, while officially subordinate to the masculine trinity, contained unmistakable resonances with earlier goddess traditions. Marian titles such as Queen of Heaven, Star of the Sea, and Mother of God echo attributes previously associated with Barbelo, Isis, and other manifestations of the divine feminine. Historian Marina Warner has documented how popular devotion to Mary often preserved elements of goddess worship despite official theological restrictions. Similarly, mystical traditions within Christianity, from Hildegard of Bingen's visions of the feminine Sophia to Jacob Boehm's conception of the divine womb, maintained connection with aspects of the divine feminine despite institutional disapproval. These persistent eruptions of feminine divine imagery suggest that the archetypal reality of Barbelo could be suppressed but never entirely eliminated from spiritual consciousness. The recovery of Gnostic texts in the modern era offers the possibility of healing this ancient wound, not by simply replacing patriarchal monotheism with matriarchal polytheism, but by restoring the complex, balanced understanding of divine reality that recognizes both masculine and feminine principles in their proper relationship. This restoration has profound implications not only for theological understanding, but for psychological wholeness, social structures, and ecological sustainability. Spiritual consequences of removing the divine feminine from theology. The excision of Barbelo from Western spiritual consciousness represents far more than an abstract theological adjustment. This cosmic motherectomy fundamentally altered humanity's relationship with divinity, with the natural world, with one another, and with our own inner life. The consequences of this spiritual amputation continue to reverberate through individual psychology, social structures, and ecological relationships, creating distinctive patterns of imbalance that characterize Western civilization. Perhaps the most immediate impact was the transformation of divinity from relationship to solitary power. With Barbelo removed from the cosmic equation, God became defined primarily through omnipotence rather than through generative relationship. Theologian Catherine Keller observes that this shift created a spirituality focused on power over rather than power with, a God who rules through command rather than nurtures through connection. This theological model naturally reproduced itself in human institutions, sanctifying hierarchical structures based on domination rather than cooperation. The psychological consequences were equally profound. Psychoanalyst Carl Jung identified the integration of masculine and feminine elements as essential to psychological wholeness. The repression of the divine feminine created what he termed a wounded anima in the Western psyche. The feminine aspect of consciousness denied expression and relegated to the shadow. This psychological wounding manifests in characteristic patterns: discomfort with emotion and embodiment, disconnection from intuitive knowing, devaluation of receptivity and nurturing, and projection of negative feminine qualities onto women and nature. Philosopher Ken Wilber describes how healthy spiritual development requires the integration of both ascending, transcendent, and descending, immanent movements of consciousness. The removal of Barbelo from theology dramatically privileged ascent over descent, seeking transcendence beyond the material world rather than discovering divinity within it. This imbalance created what Wilber calls ascender pathologies, spiritual approaches that devalue embodiment, emotion, and earthly existence in favor of disembodied intellectualism and otherworldly salvation. The ecological consequences have been particularly devastating. With the divine feminine removed from creation, nature no longer represented the living body of the goddess, but merely inert matter to be dominated. Eco-feminist Carolyn Merchant documented how the mechanistic worldview that replaced organic models directly facilitated environmental exploitation by desacralizing the natural world. Without Barbelo as the divine womb containing all creation, the material universe became merely a resource to be extracted rather than a sacred reality to be reverenced. This cosmic motherlessness also transformed humanity's relationship with time. Theologian Catherine Albanese notes that goddess-centered spiritualities typically embraced cyclical time, the recurring patterns of birth, death, and rebirth observed in nature. The exclusively masculine divine narrative introduced a linear conception of time, moving toward apocalyptic judgment rather than regenerative transformation. This shift created a spiritual framework focused on future salvation rather than present sanctity, contributing to what sociologist Max Weber identified as the distinctive disenchantment of the modern world. The absence of divine feminine imagery fundamentally altered the understanding of salvation itself. Without Barbelo as the containing womb of existence, salvation became conceptualized as rescue from a fallen material world rather than awakening to its sacred nature. This created what theologian Matthew Fox calls original sin theology, rather than original blessing theology, a perspective that sees the fundamental problem as contamination by materiality rather than ignorance of our divine nature. The practical consequence was a spirituality focused on escaping the world rather than transforming it. The social implications extended to gender relationships and sexuality. Without divine feminine models, feminine qualities became increasingly devalued in both women and men. Historian Gerda Lerner demonstrated how the rise of exclusively masculine divine imagery coincided with increasing restrictions on women's roles, rights, and autonomy. Sexuality, previously celebrated in many goddess traditions as a sacred expression of divine creative power, became increasingly problematic, associated with sin and pollution rather than with sacred connection and regeneration. Even the understanding of divine love was transformed. Theologian Elizabeth Johnson observes that when divinity is conceptualized exclusively through masculine imagery, divine love tends to be understood primarily as benevolent power and judgment, rather than as nurturing compassion and inclusive embrace. This theological shift influenced everything from parenting practices to educational systems to governmental structures, reinforcing models based on authority and compliance rather than empathy and cooperation. The impact on spiritual practice was equally significant. Contemplative traditions that emphasized receptivity, surrender, and intuitive knowing, qualities associated with the feminine principle, became increasingly marginalized in favor of doctrinal conformity and intellectual analysis. The rich tapestry of embodied spiritual practices that had characterized goddess traditions, sacred dance, ritualized sexuality, earth-based ceremonies, were condemned as pagan and replaced with more abstract, disembodied forms of worship. Perhaps most fundamentally, the erasure of Barbelo transformed the basic understanding of how humans relate to the divine. In goddess-centered traditions, divinity was understood as immanently present within nature and the human body, accessible through direct experience rather than requiring institutional mediation. The removal of the divine feminine facilitated what sociologist Peter Berger called religious alienation, the sense that divinity exists at a distance from ordinary experience, accessible only through special rituals, texts, and authorities. The recovery of Barbelo and the divine feminine tradition she represents offers the possibility of healing these various wounds, not by simply replacing patriarchal with matriarchal models, but by restoring the cosmic balance between masculine and feminine principles that characterized original Gnostic understanding. This restoration has profound implications for psychological integration, social restructuring, ecological sustainability, and spiritual renewal, suggesting that the recovery of this ancient wisdom may be essential not merely for historical accuracy, but for planetary survival. Hidden traces of Barbelo in mystical and symbolic traditions. Despite the systematic theological purge that eliminated Barbelo from official doctrine, her presence continued to permeate Western spiritual consciousness through various disguises, coded references, and symbolic manifestations. Like an underground river flowing beneath the surface of orthodoxy, the divine feminine found expression through mystical experiences, esoteric traditions, symbolic systems, and artistic representations that preserved her essential qualities while evading institutional censorship. Perhaps the most significant vehicle for Barbelo's continued presence was the cult of the Virgin Mary that emerged in the early medieval period. While officially subordinate to the masculine trinity, the popular veneration of Mary preserved crucial aspects of goddess worship within an acceptable Christian framework. Art historian Marguerite Rigoglioso has documented how Marian iconography frequently incorporated symbols previously associated with goddesses such as Isis, Cybele, and Demeter. The blue mantle, representing the cosmic vault, the crescent moon, the crown of stars, and the rose all connected Mary to earlier feminine divine imagery. Mary's titles preserved attributes remarkably similar to those of Barbelo. Theotokos, God-bearer, echoes Barbelo as Mother of All. Stella Maris, Star of the Sea, recalls Barbelo's association with primordial waters. Queen of Heaven parallels Barbelo's position in the Pleroma. The medieval prayer Salve Regina addresses Mary as our life, our sweetness, and our hope. Language strikingly similar to Gnostic descriptions of Barbelo as the source and sustenance of spiritual existence. Within the mystical traditions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the divine feminine remained a vital presence despite theological restrictions. Christian mystic Hildegard of Bingen experienced visions of divine wisdom as a feminine presence she called the living light, a luminous being who revealed cosmic secrets in a manner reminiscent of Barbelo's role in Gnostic revelation. Her illuminated manuscript Scivias depicts this feminine divine presence with imagery that parallels Gnostic descriptions of Barbelo as the womb of light containing all creation. In Jewish mystical tradition, the Kabbalistic concept of Shekinah preserved essential aspects of the divine feminine. Described as the indwelling feminine presence of God, Shekinah shares numerous attributes with Barbelo. She represents divine immanence, serves as intermediary between transcendence and manifestation, and embodies the nurturing, receptive aspects of divinity. Kabbalistic texts such as the Zohar describe Shekinah as the opening of the womb of the world, language strikingly similar to Gnostic descriptions of Barbelo as womb of the totality. Sufi mysticism similarly preserved feminine divine imagery through concepts such as Sakina, divine presence, and Layla, the beloved who represents divine reality. The great Sufi poet Rumi frequently employs feminine imagery to describe the divine, writing of the mother of the soul and declaring, "Woman is the radiance of God. She is not your beloved. She is the creator. You could say that she is not created." These expressions preserve the essential understanding of the divine feminine as the generative matrix of existence that was central to the Gnostic conception of Barbelo. Alchemical traditions provided another vehicle for the continued transmission of divine feminine wisdom. The alchemical great work fundamentally concerned the integration of masculine and feminine principles, often represented as Sol and Luna, king and queen, or sulfur and mercury. The mysterious philosopher's stone that represented the culmination of the alchemical process was frequently described in terms reminiscent of Barbelo as the womb containing all potential, the matrix of transformation, and the integrative principle that reconciles opposites. Psychologist C.G. Jung recognized these alchemical symbols as representations of the same archetypal realities described in Gnostic texts, preserved in coded form to avoid persecution. Renaissance Neoplatonism revived many concepts aligned with Gnostic understanding of the divine feminine. Marsilio Ficino's concept of the anima mundi, world soul, closely paralleled the Gnostic understanding of Barbelo as the cosmic womb containing all potential forms. Similarly, Giordano Bruno's vision of an infinite universe animated by divine intelligence preserved the essential insight that material reality is permeated by divine consciousness, a perspective aligned with the Gnostic understanding that even the flawed material world contains sparks of divine light originating in Barbelo. The Romantic movement of the 18th and 19th centuries represented another resurgence of feminine, divine imagery, often expressed through the concept of nature as a living, conscious presence rather than inert mechanism. William Blake's mythology, with its complex feminine divine figures such as Jerusalem and Enithamon, recapitulated many aspects of Gnostic cosmology, including the fall and redemption of divine feminine wisdom. Similarly, Goethe's concept of the eternal feminine, das ewig Weibliche, that draws us upward, preserved the Gnostic understanding of feminine wisdom as the principle of spiritual ascent. Symbolic systems including tarot, astrology, and sacred geometry preserved aspects of divine feminine wisdom in coded form. The High Priestess card in the tarot, sitting between pillars of duality with the crescent moon at her feet, embodies attributes of Barbelo as the mediating feminine principle between unity and multiplicity. The astrological symbol of Venus, a circle above a cross, represents spirit descending into matter, echoing the Gnostic understanding of how divine consciousness becomes embodied through the feminine principle. Even within Christian iconography, coded references to the divine feminine persisted. The mandorla, the almond-shaped aureole surrounding Christ in medieval art, derives from the vesica piscis, an ancient symbol of the feminine divine. Art historian Margaret Starbird has documented how this symbol, along with others such as the rose, the chalice and the dove, maintained connections with feminine divine imagery despite official theological restrictions. These diverse manifestations of the divine feminine across mystical traditions, symbolic systems, and artistic expressions reveal how the archetypal reality represented by Barbelo continued to find expression despite institutional suppression. Their persistence suggests that the divine feminine represents not merely a theological position, but a fundamental aspect of human spiritual experience, one that re-emerges in various forms because it corresponds to a reality too essential to be permanently erased from consciousness. The recovery of explicit knowledge about Barbelo through the Nag Hammadi texts allows these scattered fragments to be recognized as aspects of a coherent tradition, one that offers a profound alternative to the exclusively masculine divine imagery that has dominated Western theology. This recognition opens the possibility of conscious reintegration of the divine feminine, not as a rejection of masculine divine imagery, but as the restoration of cosmic balance between complementary principles that was the original Gnostic vision. The return of the feminine memory in modern spiritual awakening, the resurgence of divine feminine consciousness in contemporary spirituality, represents not merely a cultural trend, but a profound remembering, the restoration of an essential dimension of spiritual understanding that was systematically suppressed for millennia. This awakening manifests across multiple domains, from academic scholarship to grassroots spiritual movements, from psychological theory to ecological activism, suggesting a fundamental shift in Western consciousness that parallels and extends the ancient Gnostic understanding of Barbelo as the womb of divine reality. The archaeological and scholarly rediscovery of the divine feminine began with the excavation of prehistoric goddess figurines in the early 20th century, challenging the assumption that monotheistic patriarchy represented humanity's original religious impulse. Archaeologist Maria Gimbutas's groundbreaking work documenting the sophisticated goddess-centered cultures of Neolithic Europe provided compelling evidence that veneration of the divine feminine preceded patriarchal religious systems by thousands of years. This archaeological record found its textual complement in the 1945 discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, which revealed the sophisticated theological frameworks surrounding divine feminine figures such as Barbelo and Sophia in early Christian contexts. Feminist theology emerged as a systematic attempt to recover and reintegrate feminine divine imagery within existing religious traditions. Scholars such as Rosemary Radford Ruther, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, and Elaine Pagels demonstrated how the elimination of the divine feminine represented not an inevitable theological development, but a deliberate political process serving specific power interests. Their work revealed how references to feminine divine presence in early Christian texts, including imagery of God as mother and the Holy Spirit as feminine, were systematically eliminated to consolidate patriarchal authority in both church and society. The depth psychology movement initiated by Carl Jung provided crucial psychological frameworks for understanding the significance of divine feminine imagery. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious, populated by archetypes, including the Great Mother, the Anima, and Sophia, offered a psychological explanation for why feminine divine imagery persistently re-emerges despite cultural suppression. Jungian analyst Erich Neumann's monumental work, The Great Mother, trace the development and suppression of feminine divine imagery throughout human history, demonstrating its psychological necessity for both individual and collective wholeness. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s catalyzed widespread interest in goddess spirituality as both a historical recovery project and a contemporary spiritual path. Influential works such as Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman and Starhawk's The Spiral Dance reintroduced goddess-centered spiritual practices to mainstream Western culture. What distinguished this movement from mere nostalgic revival was its integration of contemporary concerns, particularly ecological consciousness and women's empowerment, with recovered ancient wisdom about the sacred feminine. The emergence of ecofeminism in the 1980s and 1990s established crucial connections between divine feminine imagery and environmental consciousness. Scholars such as Carolyn Merchant, Vandana Shiva, and Joanna Macy demonstrated how the desacralization of nature directly followed from the elimination of goddess imagery in Western religion. Their work suggested that recovering the understanding of Earth as the body of the goddess, similar to how Gnostics understood the material world as containing fallen fragments of Sophia's light, provides essential spiritual foundation for environmental ethics based on reverence rather than exploitation. Contemporary neuroscience offers intriguing parallels to ancient understanding of the divine feminine. The discovery that the human brain contains complementary systems, the sympathetic, activating, and parasympathetic, restorative nervous systems, mirrors the Gnostic understanding of complementary divine principles. Psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist's research on brain hemispheres reveals how the right hemisphere's holistic, contextual awareness, traditionally associated with feminine consciousness, complements the left hemisphere's analytical, sequential processing, traditionally associated with masculine consciousness, suggesting that full cognitive functioning requires the integration of qualities attributed to both masculine and feminine divine principles in Gnostic thought. The rise of integral and evolutionary spirituality, developed by thinkers such as Ken Wilber and Andrew Cohen, represents a sophisticated contemporary parallel to Gnostic cosmology. Their recognition that spiritual development requires integrating both transcendent and immanent dimensions, both ascending and descending currents of consciousness, mirrors the Gnostic understanding that true spiritual wholeness requires honoring both Barbelo, the stable matrix of divine reality, and Sophia, the dynamic movement of divine wisdom into manifestation. This integral approach avoids both patriarchal transcendentalism that devalues embodiment and regressive goddess worship that rejects transcendent awareness. Indigenous wisdom traditions, increasingly recognized in global spiritual discourse, preserve understandings of divine feminine presence remarkably similar to Gnostic conceptions. Native American traditions speak of Grandmother Earth and Sky Woman in terms that parallel descriptions of Barbelo and Sophia. African traditions preserve knowledge of feminine divine powers, such as Oshun, Yemaya, and Oya, that embody different aspects of what Gnostics attributed to Barbelo. This cross-cultural resonance suggests that the divine feminine represents not merely a cultural construct, but a consistent human recognition of an actual spiritual reality. The contemporary mindfulness movement, while not explicitly focused on divine feminine imagery, emphasizes qualities traditionally associated with feminine consciousness: receptivity, embodied awareness, non-judgment, and compassionate presence. These qualities align closely with how Gnostic texts describe Barbelo's mode of consciousness as open, receptive awareness that contains all without rejection or fragmentation. This suggests that even seemingly secular approaches to consciousness development may be facilitating reconnection with aspects of divine feminine wisdom. Transpersonal psychology, developed by thinkers such as Stanislav Grof and Abraham Maslow, has documented how spontaneous mystical experiences frequently involve encounters with feminine divine presence. Groff's research on non-ordinary states of consciousness reveals consistent patterns of experience, including cosmic unity, encounter with the Great Mother, and death-rebirth sequences that parallel Gnostic descriptions of spiritual awakening as remembrance of connection with Barbelo and liberation from the constraints of material existence created by the demiurge. What distinguishes contemporary divine feminine awakening from mere revival of ancient goddess worship is its integration with evolutionary consciousness. Rather than simply returning to pre-modern conceptions, today's divine feminine spirituality integrates scientific understanding, psychological sophistication, and social justice awareness with recovered ancient wisdom. This creates what cultural historian Richard Tarnas calls a complex marriage of pre-modern, modern, and postmodern elements. A perspective that honors ancient wisdom while engaging contemporary knowledge and concerns. This multifaceted remembering of Barbelo and the divine feminine represents not merely academic recovery, but living spiritual awakening with profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our world. By restoring awareness of the divine feminine as the womb of existence, contemporary spiritual consciousness opens the possibility of healing the fundamental wounds created by her historical erasure, reintegrating matter and spirit, body and consciousness, nature and culture, feminine and masculine in a vision of sacred wholeness that aligns with the original Gnostic understanding that all existence emerges from and returns to the luminous womb of Barbelo, mother of all. Final reflection: if Barbelo is the origin, what still needs to be remembered? Standing at this threshold of remembrance, where ancient Gnostic wisdom meets contemporary spiritual awakening, we confront a profound question. If Barbelo truly represents the original divine feminine principle from which all creation emerges, what dimensions of this primordial truth still await our recognition? What aspects of her wisdom remain veiled, and what might be the consequences of their full remembrance? Perhaps the most radical implication of recognizing Barbelo as the origin is the complete reconceptualization of divine nature. The traditional Western understanding of God as a transcendent, exclusively masculine creator who stands apart from creation gives way to recognition of divinity as a dynamic relationship between complementary principles. The ineffable source and its first self-expression, the transcendent Father and the immanent Mother, the potential and its manifestation. This shift transforms theology from a framework based on hierarchy and separation to one grounded in relationship and integration. This relational understanding of divinity naturally extends to human identity. If we emerge from the divine womb of Barbelo rather than from the command of a distant creator, our essential nature is one of connection rather than separation. The Gnostic recognition that humans contain divine sparks, fragments of Barbelo's light trapped in material existence, suggests that our deepest identity is not as isolated individuals, but as expressions of divine consciousness temporarily experiencing limitation. This perspective offers profound healing for what philosopher Alan Watts called the illusion of separateness, the mistaken perception of isolation that underlies much human suffering. The remembrance of Barbelo invites reconsideration of matter itself, rather than viewing physical reality as fallen, corrupt, or merely inert substance. We might recognize it as the outermost expression of divine emanation, containing within its density the hidden light of Barbelo, awaiting recognition. This perspective transforms our relationship with embodiment from rejection or ambivalence to reverent engagement, recognizing the body not as a prison for the soul, but as a living temple wherein divine consciousness experiences itself in form. Such recognition aligns with quantum physics' discovery that matter itself is ultimately a form of energy. condensed light, as Einstein's famous equation demonstrates. The ecological implications are equally profound. If the natural world represents not merely the flawed creation of an ignorant demiurge, but a complex system containing fragments of divine light, then environmental ethics becomes not merely practical necessity, but spiritual imperative. The destruction of ecosystems represents not simply material damage, but the desecration of divine presence. This understanding provides spiritual foundation for the deep ecology articulated by philosophers such as Arne Naess and Thomas Berry, who recognize intrinsic rather than merely utilitarian value in natural systems. For psychology and personal development, the remembrance of Barbelo offers a template for wholeness that integrates rather than fragments human experience. If divine reality itself encompasses both transcendent and immanent aspects, both masculine and feminine principles, then human psychological health similarly requires integration of these complementary dimensions. This perspective aligns with integral psychology's recognition that complete human development involves honoring both ascending movements toward transcendence and descending movements toward embodiment. A balance strikingly similar to the Gnostic understanding of the complementary functions of Barbelo and Sophia. The social and political implications extend beyond individual psychology to collective structures. If the divine feminine represents not a subordinate, but an equal, and in some ways primary principle in cosmic reality, then social arrangements based on gender hierarchy lack metaphysical foundation. The remembrance of Barbelo provides spiritual grounding for social organization based on partnership rather than domination. Models aligned with what cultural historian Rian Eisler identifies as the partnership paradigm that characterized goddess-centered cultures before the rise of patriarchal domination systems. The recovery of Barbelo's wisdom offers profound healing for humanity's relationship with sexuality. In Gnostic understanding, the syzygy, divine partnership, of masculine and feminine principles at cosmic levels establishes the sacred template for human sexual relationship. This perspective reconsecrates sexuality as participation in the generative pattern of the cosmos rather than as fallen biological function. Such understanding provides spiritual foundation for honoring the sacred dimension of sexual connection without either puritanical rejection or exploitative objectification. Perhaps most fundamentally, the remembrance of Barbelo challenges linear apocalyptic conceptions of time with a cyclical understanding based on eternal return. If all existence emerges from and returns to the divine womb of Barbelo, then spiritual fulfillment comes not through escaping time, but through recognizing its sacred pattern of emergence and return, manifestation and reabsorption. This perspective aligns with both ancient wisdom traditions and contemporary physics in recognizing that linear time represents a limited perspective on a more complex reality in which, as T.S. Eliot wrote, "The end is where we start from." What awaits us if we fully remember Barbelo is not merely theological revision, but comprehensive transformation of consciousness. A shift from fragmentation to integration, from isolation to connection, from domination to partnership, from exploitation to reverence. This remembering involves not rejection of masculine divine imagery, but its restoration to proper relationship with the feminine divine that both precedes and encompasses it. Such integration offers healing for the fundamental wounds of Western consciousness, the false separations between spirit and matter, mind and body, humanity and nature, masculine and feminine that have created cascading crises at psychological, social, and ecological levels. The whisper of Barbelo echoes through the chambers of our collective memory, inviting us to remember what was never truly forgotten. That before separation, there was connection. Before command, there was emanation. Before the Father, there was the Mother Father. Before time began, there was the luminous womb from which all emerges and to which all returns. This remembrance is not merely historical recovery, but living awakening to the truth of our origin and destiny, that we emerge from and return to the infinite embrace of Barbelo, the mother of all, whose light shines in every particle of existence awaiting our recognition. In the silence between these words, in the space between your thoughts, in the pause between your breaths, she waits, not in some distant realm, but in the very fabric of your being. Listen closely, and you might hear her whisper, "I am the first and the last. I am the honored one and the scorned one. I am the beginning and the end. I am Barbelo, and you are my children. Remember." If these words have awakened something dormant within you, join our community of seekers. Every subscription fuels the flame that keeps this ancient knowledge alive in the world, illuminating the path toward remembrance of our divine origin and destiny.